I'm Kwame Coleman for the Black Power Chronicles, joined today by Milton Coleman, distinguished American journalist, newspaper editor, media critic now, I guess it's fair to say, Milton, in some respects. Milton, welcome.
Thank you.
Milton, your career spans Greensboro, North Carolina, and Africa World newspaper, the Washington Post, and onward. I wonder if, we've been trying to start early in life with people and ask them about the issue of being black, your story of being black and in America, and your story of your relationship to the phrase Black Power when you first heard it. Can you pick up your life anywhere you want along that timeline?
Well, I grew up in Milwaukee and in public housing, public schools, all the way through. And of course, the Black Power phrase came about in 1966, what I used to call the Declaration of Greenwood. And at the time, I was a college student at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. I'd come out of an inner city school where the best thing we had going for us was the basketball team, but a lot of good teachers. And it was a time of a coming of age because of Dr. King and because of the civil rights movement and because of a lot of things that I didn't understand as clearly as I do now, having read Isabel Wilkerson's book, The Warmth of Other Suns, which helped me understand a lot of things that was going on during my youth. But it was a time when those of us who, academics and sports and community involvement and parental guidance and everything, all those things said, there's something you have to contribute. You need to develop that on behalf of the race. And that sort of, I guess, is what propelled me. So I'm in college, and we're all there. We were a small band of people. I think at the time UWM had 11,000 students. There were maybe 250 who were black, and most of us at the time, UWM was a commuter campus. Most of us took the bus to school. We came out of a segregated school system, a northern segregated school system. I mean, ours was a multicultural school, but all the black kids wound up at 3 or 4 schools. And so you say, what am I going to do? And there's an integrationist strain of activity, and then along comes Stokely and Black Power and ties to Marcus Garvey and the Nation of Islam, and you kind of decide, so what am I going to do? Because I'm not going to college just for me. I mean, I got in here, and I'm supported by folks in my community. You know, they were the ones who told me that, boy, you can write. Oh, thank you. Or you can investigate, what we call reporting. And so at that point, I think the black student movement pulled me over. And at the time I entered college, by the time I finished college, I wasn't thinking about being a journalist. I'd gone to college expecting to be a high school band director, because the guy who was my mentor in high school was the band director. I wanted to be a high school band director. And the student movement changed my mind on that. I got into journalism through the black newspapers in my hometown, given a break by the guy who was the editor of 2 or 3 of them, a guy named Walter Jones, who I think went to Tennessee State. And my first city editor was a black woman, Carol Malone, who taught me a lot of the things about journalism that to this day still drive me, like the notion that the good thing about being a journalist is that you get paid to know other people's business, which was fun. She was absolutely right. You know, or a guy named Kenneth Lumpkin, who was a photographer from Alabama, who used to work for the Southern Courier, who taught me all about images in photojournalism and all that. And that sort of was my start in journalism, and I tried, and still try, to say, how can I use my journalism to contribute to what is really the calling of my generation, which was the civil rights / human rights / black power / whatever movement.
You responded to that call, felt a sense of responsibility. Was that common among those around you, special to you and other, if you will, intellectuals in particular? And how was the Black Power call different from the other slashes, the civil rights, human rights?
Well, where one was at that time during the movement years, depended on where you were in your head and where you were in relation to the movement. And nowadays we hear a lot of talk about how the Kerner Commission report changed the face of American news journalism, because it pointed out that not only was the nation headed toward 2 societies, one black and one white, and distinctly unequal, but that the newspapers had been a part of that, and that sort of, and newspapers at the time I was growing up, that was where the action was. TV was just barely coming on, and the internet we didn't know anything about that, and nobody did, and so on the one hand, the popular analysis that you hear is that is what brought diversity into the news media. And it did bring diversity into the news media. But at the same time, the most popular book among college students during the time I was at UWM, from 1963 to 1968, was the autobiography of Malcolm X. And you had to read that book. And what Malcolm talked about was what at the time we called black nationalism, and black power was a black nationalism kind of refrain, kind of call. And Malcolm talked not so much about integrating the news media, but about what the news media did vis-a-vis black folks and black communities. And if you listened to a lot of Malcolm's most famous speeches that were available on recordings, like in The Message to the Grassroots, he talked about some of the same things that are being talked about now. I had some students at Arizona State University last year. I played for them passages from The Message to the Grassroots, and some of the students came up to me afterwards, having heard Malcolm talk about the Harlem riots of, I think it was 1964, 1963, about a young black man who was killed. And they said, that's just like Black Lives Matter. And I said, yeah. And so some of us who went into journalism went in there because we thought we could make a difference there. And we went in there not just to get a job in journalism, but to use journalism as our way of trying to contribute to what was going on. Because if you read Malcolm, and if you read Martin, or if you heard them, the civil rights movement succeeded because the press covered it. And a lot of the journalists who then went on to greater careers after having covered that were white journalists. You know, I think Tom Brokaw just this week was saying that that made a difference for him. Dan Rather made a difference for him. There were relatively few black people involved in mainstream media at that point. There were some. And it was a time when, if you look at American free press journalism, a lot of the fundamental rulings that support journalism came about at that time. You know, a journalist's basic protection against libel suits came as a result of the Supreme Court decision, which we know as the New York Times versus Sullivan, Times v. Sullivan, which resulted from public officials in Alabama trying to sue the New York Times because it published an ad, actually, not a news story, but an ad, criticizing them for doing their job as public officials. And the court came back and said, no, you can't collect money from people saying things about your work as a public official. Not only do you have to prove that what was reported was wrong, because what was in that ad was inaccurate, but you have to prove that it was done with actual malice. That, in other words, not only did you say something about, not only did they say something about you that was wrong, they knew it was wrong and they said it anyway. And Times v. Sullivan thus became the landmark decision. Or the basic idea of the protection of the confidentiality of journalists' resources came as a result of 3 or 4 different cases which said there's something called limited privilege. And one of those cases was involved Earl Caldwell. Then at the New York Times, when the Justice Department, the FBI, told Earl, you have to tell us who your sources are in the Black Panther Party, and Earl said, I will not. And the court then said there's a limited privilege that involves Earl Caldwell and other cases, but then a whole bunch of states passed laws that are called shield laws that protect journalists. And so that was the spirit of that times. And those of us who went into the business, a lot of us went in there saying, can I make a difference? And when I first went into journalism at the Milwaukee Courier, it was because I felt I could make a difference. And I had a publisher at the time, Gerald Jones, who was young, a few years older than I am now. And Gerald was a young upstart in that business. He was young for a publisher of a black newspaper, but he saw in the Courier some of the traditions of the black newspapers of earlier years, you know, of the Chicago Daily Defender, the Atlanta Daily World, the New York Amsterdam News, the Senstack chain of newspapers, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Afro-American newspapers, all of whom had followed in the tradition of Ida B. Wells, who had reported things that mainline press would not report, you know. So a number of us who went into the black media and then went into mainstream media did so because we thought we could make that kind of a difference. You know, some of those who, when I was contemplating whether I should go into mainstream media, and they said, well, you're going to get chances there to do things covering black folks in the black community that you're not going to get at black newspapers because the black newspapers don't have the resources. The mainline newspapers have those resources, and you'll get a shot at being in one of those beats. You'll be able to cover the White House better than Ethel Payne, not because you're a better reporter than Ethel Payne, but because if you could do it for the Washington Post, the New York Times, or even the Dayton Daily News or the Christian Science Monitor, you can do it better. And hopefully you'll do it with some sense of being black.
It's an excellent presentation. I should have mentioned your work as a distinguished professor of journalism as well. And we should appreciate your notation of the names Earl Caldwell and Ethel Payne, who people will be interested to look into, those who don't already know. Were you, in choosing to go to the mainstream, to use your talents there, were you exercising Black Power? Were you still answering that call that initially motivated you?
Well, I came to the Washington Post after having spent several years working for black-oriented news operations. My first newspaper job was at the Milwaukee Courier, a black weekly, and then I went to, then I did community organizing and wound up working for the Student Organization for Black Unity, Cebu, and running their newspaper, which first was called the Cebu Newsletter. We later changed it to the African World, modeled after Marcus Garvey's newspaper. We changed the name of it, the African World, but it was a Pan-African newspaper. And I worked for Community News Service, which was based in New York. I was their Washington correspondent. Then I worked for, I ran my own news service, the All African News Service, which was aimed at black weeklies and black college newspapers. And then I worked at WHUR before going to into the summer program, the Michelle Clark summer program for minority journalists at the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University, all of which were black-oriented programs and operations. All this before I went to the Minneapolis Star. And in all of those, it was, there was a direct connection because I felt that I was writing about black folks and I was writing primarily for black folks. Or in the case of WHUR, I was on the radio primarily for black folks. And then I go into white media. I go to the Minneapolis Star for 2 years, and then I come to the Washington Post. And one of the things that was really exciting to me about coming to the Washington Post was to have the chance to cover the local government in the District of Columbia. Why? Because it's a black town, you know. So I get to do that, knowing that I'm going to do that for a newspaper that has a different approach to journalism than what I had been used to, which essentially was advocacy journalism. It was specialized journalism. At all those places, we tried to do journalism from a black perspective and for a black audience. And I certainly wasn't going to be able to do that at the Washington Post, but I knew that because I had done journalism at the Minneapolis Star. And in fact, one of the things that some of my editors at the Post were happy to have me covering the district building was they said, here's a guy who's going to come to work in a place where race is a political issue. But he's covered politics in a place where race was not a political issue, Minneapolis, because they used to always argue that the black community in Minneapolis was about 15 people, 12 since me and my family left, you know. And a friend of mine had told my wife and I when we moved to Minneapolis that you have to understand that in Minneapolis, the black community is predominantly white. I said, okay, I got it, you know. But I still believed that there were things from my experience that I could work into my coverage for the Washington Post that would be valuable to getting out an accurate picture. Because a lot of the complaint against mainstream media was not so much that it was racially biased, but a lot of what was perceived as the black side of the story was never covered. It didn't get in there. And over my years in journalism, I've come to believe, and in fact to try to teach to people, that as journalists, when you see a story that you think is racially not balanced, is racially unfair, don't argue diversity, argue journalism. Because if you believe in the tenets of journalism that we all lay out, you'll see where that story is bad, not because the reporter is racist, I can't figure that out, not because the newspaper or the TV station or the online site is racist, but because that's bad journalism. They didn't talk to the people on the other side. It's not balanced. They asked stupid questions. They didn't follow up. All the things that journalism and journalism ethics tell you to do, somewhere along the line, they followed that. They didn't follow that. They fell short. And that's how you argue. Because we're not going to win arguing diversity. We're journalists. We're not diversity advocates. We're journalists. And we argue journalism. And I can show you where I don't care whether you're a racist. I care what kind of journalism you practice. And because we're here to practice journalism. And that was bad journalism, and I can show you. And in that regard, you bring that kind of thinking into the mainstream. And if you succeed, you help the coverage of the black community. During all the time that people were arguing about the coverage of bad government in the Washington Post, or the coverage of black folks in the Washington Post, all of our surveys would always show that our black readers, they didn't want to be lied to. They wanted to know the truth. They didn't want things to be spun. And that's fine, because I'm a journalist. I'm in the truth business. We can get along.
Before we go more into your experience in very black, particularly at that time, Washington, D.C., the Washington Post, your close coverage of two of the primary figures of the Black Power movement, Ivanhoe Donaldson and Marion Barry. I want to stay in the 60, 67 period for a moment to ask you as an intellectual, as an observer, as a student of Garvey, the Nation of Islam, black nationalism, what was Black Power to you? I tried to write down whether Black Power is a coherent intellectual framework or a practical political philosophy.
Black Power was, it was a sort of a phrase that described a certain responsibility, an outlook of people who were black. And it was a form of black nationalism. It was a form of it could include a form of Pan-Africanism. It had civil rights all involved in it. I guess as a student at UWM, by the time I left, I had begun to call myself a Malcolmist. because all these things that came together, to me, were best expressed in the life and death of Malcolm X through its entirety. And not that, I mean, I was, unlike Malcolm, I never spent time in prison. I was never, I think Malcolm talked about how good of a cat burglar he was. I was not. I was not in the Nation of Islam. But but Malcolm was like a lot of people that I grew up with and people I came in contact with. You know, my dad and my older brother both spent time in prison, and they both rest in peace. And a lot of guys I grew up with went that way. So the whole notion of Black Power, as it came out, it prescribed for one a certain way of conducting one's life. You know, as a Christian, I always say that what the Bible always tells you is, here's a way to live your life. That's what you can learn from Jesus Christ. And in that regard, all of the things that came to be involved with Black Power, this is a way you can live your life. This is a way you can accomplish things that you think ought to be accomplished. That was sort of the guide that I got from following all of that, because this whole thing about, my thing about Malcolmism and being a Malcolmist, there was no such philosophy as that, I don't think. But for me, it was a call, I think, to what at the time we called it Black nationalism, you know, which talked about a certain responsibility to, and a certain orientation. I mean, you know, I mentioned to you earlier that I was going to be a high school band director, because my high school band director, who was white, really was a mentor to me, you know, and I went in to college saying I'm going to be a good high school band director and all that kind of stuff. And the book that changed my life, which I read around the same time I was reading the autobiography of Malcolm X, was Blues People by Leroy Jones, later known as Amiri Baraka. Another book that I read at the time, The Myth of the Negro Past by a Northwestern University anthropologist, Melville J. Herskovitz. And it talked about African survivals. And so I'm at UWM, I'm supposed to be a band director. A couple of years in there, I changed my major. I said, what do you want to be? I want to be an ethnomusicologist. Ethnomusicologist, yeah, I want to specialize in African and African-American music. And why? Because that fit into what was happening in my mind at the time, reading Malcolm and reading Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, or Dame de la Terre, and having heard Dr. King speak in Milwaukee once, but also having heard Wyatt T. Walker speak there, listening to Malcolm's records. And then along comes this guy, Stokely Carmichael, in the Declaration of Greenwood, talking about Black Power. And I didn't meet Stokely until several years later. But it was enough so that at that time, when I'm still at UWM, we get involved with the Black student movement. We do fundraisers after the Orangeburg massacre, and that becomes our connection, you know. And so I think that's the way Black Power figured into it.
This young political figure, well, first a community figure, Marion Barry, and then a political figure, school board, city council, rising through the ranks quickly as an elected official, would mount an insurgent campaign against the more traditional Black candidates in Washington, D.C. For mayor. What was your impression of of Marion Barry early on as he mounted that campaign, as you came to be close to him and to his campaign director, doing the daily work of watching that what would turn out to be a seminal national political event?
Well, after I left UWM and got involved with Cebu, I had an outlook on black power and black nationalism and blackness that was much farther to the left, very much to the left. I mean, when I left Cebu, they were getting into the dialectical method and Marxism and clearly all of those things. And I had, by the time I got to the Post and met Marion Barry, I knew of John Wilson because when I was a college student and trying to get out of the draft, Johnny Wilson was the head of MBAWADU, the National Black Anti-War, Anti-Draft Union, and I was hell-bent on being a conscientious objector. And during the time I was at Cebu and running my own news service and all that, I had come to see people involved in electoral politics as right of center in the movement, because I'd met Cleve Sellers and Cortland Cox and Charlie Cobb, and I knew of Ivanhoe from the time when I believe Ivanhoe was on the board of the Cummins Engine Foundation, and we at Cebu were trying to get some money from him, and actually I think when I first met Minister Farrakhan, it was when I was at the Minneapolis Star. So I come to Washington sort of frowning upon electoral politics, but trying to understand it and all. And having been led to believe that Marion Barry was right of center, because he was in electoral politics, and though he may have been an early chairman of SNCC, he'd gone to New York and he was a fundraiser, and so he a lot of people would have said at that point, Marion sold out, and of course, I mean, who was in the more sellout position of anybody, be it the Washington Post? But okay, that's a different story. So when I met Marion and encountered Marion and Ivanhoe, I was a little bit perplexed. What do I think of these guys? But also because I had seen politics in operation, having covered, excuse me, the Minneapolis City Council, I could see what was political about Marion and what was racial about Marion, even though at the time what was racial about Marion was really sort of hidden because Walter Washington and Sterling Tucker had their hooks into the established black community. Walter was into the churches and Sterling was into the business people, and Marion was connected with the grassroots folks, having run Pride Incorporated, which was viewed as a shakedown operation, by many people. And Marion Barry was this sort of uncouth guy, rough at the edges, the proper black elite considered him Bama country, didn't know how to talk, you know. As I once said, too rough ever to be a diamond, you know. And so I meet this guy, Marion, and he's working with Ivanhoe. I hadn't met Ivanhoe at that point, but he's running the Finance and Revenue Committee. Now wait a minute. Historically and traditionally, black folks can't count. So what's this? Oh, and this guy, he went to university. He was a doctoral candidate in chemistry. Doug Moore wouldn't let him forget that. Doug Moore would call him an alchemist, you know, and stress the difference between chemistry and alchemy, alchemistry, whatever it is, whatever alchemists practice. And so it took me a while to understand the black parts of Marion, though I really understood the political parts of him, you know, and I could see where what he did politically was very smart as a politician. And to whatever degree Ivanhoe was a part of that, that was good. And I quickly came to understand that Ivanhoe, in many respects, was the political mind, maybe even the bureaucratic mind. You know, back in those days, as you will recall, having been on the press staff, the mayor's office was at one end of the mayoral suite, along with Herb Reed's office. Herb was the legal counsel, and the press office. Florence's office, your office was down there too. And on the other end was the city administrator and the special assistant to the mayor, who was Ivanhoe. I don't know what Ivanhoe's title was, but I would go in there. I would go in to talk to Herb Reed, who was, I could say now, was a great source. And I'd say, so Herb, where's the mayor? I need to talk to the mayor. And Herb would point to Marion's office, then he'd point to Ivanhoe's office, and he'd say, which mayor do you mean? The one at this end of the hall or that end of the hall? You know, and so I came to understand that Ivanhoe was the political mind. But later on, it became clear how Marion was becoming the black mind. And by the election of 1982, it was clear to me that Marion had written the book, along with Ivanhoe, I guess, of how you win in DC politics, because he understood where the black vote was and how to get the black vote. And that came out of his experiences in SNCC. And I also understood that a lot about politicians, not just what I was telling you earlier about how you win an election by identifying your voters and getting them out, but also how Marion understood how you win in a city with politics polarized by race, you know, and I think it was Ivanhoe who talked about the importance of which wards were important, you know, that because they were the big Democratic wards, and the importance of the wards in a citywide election changed because you brought in the white wards, you know, but the biggest wards were the black wards with strong Democratic importance. So, and then the programs that Marion pushed, you know, the summer jobs program, the effort to try to create what Marion said were black millionaires through minority contracting. And something which Marion started on early, but then later on fell by the wayside, is effort to change the schools. You know, because the Berry political machine, for a couple of years there, every year they would pick off somebody on the school board. And so in that way I began to understand the blackness in Marion Barry, which later came under strong attack, which Marion in many ways invited by his misbehaviors through his womanizing and drug addiction. Does that answer your question?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There are many in Washington who believe that Marion Barry and Ivanhoe Donaldson were exercising Black Power using the philosophies from SNCC and the Black Power movement to empower, as you say, create Black millionaires from the contracting community and elsewhere in the business community, to empower young people with jobs, young people from poor families with jobs, to help the elderly, the Black elderly. Knowing that there's always an aspect of bare knuckle politics to any big city politicking, or any other probably for that matter. As you would talk to Ivanhoe and to Marion quietly, one-to-one, did you feel that motivation? Did you feel that they were still carrying out, not to make a judgment on them, but they are often put up as the actualizers of Black Power because they gained elective office and power in a way others who arose from the Black Power movement did not?
Well, I think one of the things that people overlook when they look at the 60s and what gets put under the rubric of the civil rights movement is a false equivalency is made between SCLC and SNCC, between the civil rights movement and Black Power. Black Power was part of the civil rights movement, but the thing that SNCC did that stood out to me as an observer, because during the heyday of SNCC, I was in Milwaukee, they were political. And people forget that the Black Power movement and the Black Panther Party started as the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, a political movement, and that SNCC was involved with voter registration, and that was political, you know, and that was empowering Black people in the South, and the Washington that I came to first in 1972 was, and many would still argue still is, a Southern town. And so what Ivanhoe and Marion and Cortland Cox and all those other, because the SNCC people, a lot of the SNCC people who settled in Washington, they became a real interest group in Washington. Just like you could say that there was that the Black church people in 1978 were Walter Washington's people. The Black business people were Sterling Tucker's people. A part of Marion Barry's people were the SNCC people, you know, or the people who had operated on the edge of SNCC, whether that was people who were directly involved with SNCC, who got directly involved in Marion's campaign and his government, like Cortland Cox, like Florence Tate, like Frank Smith, you know, they were a group, you know, and a group that I knew well, you know, and some of them were involved with Marion, some of them were like Ackland Lynch, and they saw ties to C.L.R. James, you know, in the same way that they saw ties to Sterling Brown. I mean, they were all part of that particular generation. And in doing what the Barry administration did, they were putting Black Power into the politics of the nation's capital. So yeah, that was it. Because my sense of what Marion did is he took a huge chunk of his base was white in 78. And beginning on January 2nd, 1979, he started melding that base with Walters and Sterling's base. And by 1982, that had become the Barry political machine. And it would dominate home rule politics for years to come. And the manifestation of that was that in order to get elected, you had to go by Marion and Ivanhoe's rules. And nobody was better at doing that than Marion Barry. Here's a guy who gets sent to prison, spends time in prison, gets out of prison, and gets reelected. Come on. I mean, you can't do that without being a good politician, you know. And they had made that the way you do business in D.C. So yeah, I think they were doing that. And Marion's effort to get connected with the churches who had supported Walter Washington was an effort to do what often, I gathered, was done in the South, where when you went into Lowndes County, Mississippi, or when you went into Alabama, or when you went into Georgia, you tried to get connected with the churches. Well, Marion couldn't do that at the time, but later on he tried to do that. Always limited a little bit because Marion Barry was Marion Barry, but you tried to do that. And I think what Marion, I'm confident what Marion saw, because I interviewed him just before he became the mayor on January 2nd, 1979. And when he talked about trying to create some black millionaires, that's the same thing that other people were trying to do in the South, but they didn't have to work with that as rich in many ways, not just monetarily, as rich a black community. There was no difference in the role that Howard University played in Black Washington than North Carolina A&T State played in Greensboro, or that Morehouse and Spelman and Clark Atlanta and the others played in Atlanta, you know. So they were just taking this particular, for lack of a better term, highfalutin black community in DC and doing with it in local politics what people had been trying to do with the Lowndes County Freedom Organization in 1964, once they could get them folks the right to vote, and what later was to happen in Atlanta and throughout Georgia and throughout Mississippi and Alabama and Tennessee and South Carolina and North Carolina, and what was trying to be emulated in Gary, Indiana, and Chicago and New York and all over. It was the same thing.
And that was Black Power.
That was Black Power, yeah. That was what was implied in the Declaration of Greenwood in 1966.
And then so there's no doubt that young people got summer jobs that launched them onto college careers where they might not have had that in their destiny prior to the Marion Barry Summer Youth Program, that low-income elderly people got services they wouldn't, and that those and middle-class African Americans got jobs and contracts and government work that allowed them to buy houses in nearby Prince George's County. There was no doubt that black people were empowered economically and otherwise by the actions of these Black Power advocates who had taken the electoral reins.
Right. No doubt. No, I do. No doubt that was the case, and that the Marion Barry, the politician, was able to do that because he was in Washington and he was the mayor of Washington, and Fannie Lou Hamer couldn't do that in Ruleville, Mississippi. I think she became the mayor of Ruleville at one point. But people in those black belt shanty towns down south, that was not Washington, D.C. They wanted to do the same thing, and many of them probably have or did, but it was played out on a grand scale because it was Marion Barry and it was Washington, D.C. And remember, Marion was part of that first generation of black mayors. And I'll leave it up to people to argue whether Marion Barry was more successful that vis-a-vis his black constituents in Washington than was Dick Hatcher in Gary, or Carl Stokes in Cleveland, or David Dinkins in New York, or Maynard Jackson and Andy Young in Atlanta. And you go from there.
Very good. Milton, I wanted to wrap up by again drawing on your knowledge and experience and expertise in the broad intellectual movement of black nationalism, black power, Pan-Africanism, as it's considered as part of a worldwide movement. As we know, Stokely Carmichael traveled a great deal. There were lots of associations with liberation movements around the globe. Where do you put the American Black Power movement in what you described as civil rights / human rights / black nationalism as a petri dish for changes that affected the globe in that period of catalytic change in of the 60s that had a worldwide effect in any event?
Oh, I think it was very critical. You know, several years ago, my wife and I went to South Africa, and it was clear to me in meeting South Africans that they held African Americans in a special regard. And you would ask them why, and they would say, because of the role you played in helping us to get our freedom. And that role was as powerful, as forceful, as effective as it was because it was the United States of America and what we were doing in the United States of America. And then if you look at all of the connections that came about years later, I think it is fair to say that just as many Americans will ask their fathers, or Americans of my generation will say, "Daddy, what did you do during the war?" A lot can be said if black folks ask their elders, "What did you do during the 60s?" Because a lot of the people who became important in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and even up through now, that importance is related to what they did during the 60s. And a part of that was what the black nationalist movements in all their many manifestations, whether it was Black Power, whether it was the Nation of Islam, whether it was the Black Panther Party, whether it was the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, you name them. Where were you, and how did that affect you and affect what you did and what you became? In the past 40-something years that I've been fortunate enough to be involved in things, I keep running into people who I knew from the movement, or I knew their mother, or I knew their father, you know, and those were the things that that made a difference, you know, and just like as we started out, those of us who went into journalism, there was some, when the Kerner Commission beat up on the mainline news media and a lot of us started getting hired, some of us went in there because of the jobs. It was a good job. Some of us went in there because of the prestige. Some of us went in there because we had listened to Malcolm, we had read the autobiography, we had listened to Amiri Baraka, we had seen SNCC. We went in there to improve the information that black folks got in order to make the decisions that affected their lives. And the black nationalist movement, of which Black Power was a major thrust, a major strain, affected us. And so we went in there not to become a black Walter Cronkite, not to win Pulitzer Prizes, but to see how we could get this powerful institution to serve our communities, to serve our friends, our parents, our churches. And you see that amplified all over the world. And you see it amplified in what's happening in Africa, what's happening in Asia, all of those things. So that was the importance of that. That was the importance of that to what has now become mainstream media, but which still has to reach out because there are still things that the Black Power folks of this generation, they don't call it Black Power, they'll call it some other things, but they're working for the same things. And they're beating up on the media, rightfully so, for not doing a lot of the same things that we beat up on the media for not doing 50 years ago.
Milton Coleman, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
That's fantastic.